Okay, thank you very much for joining us, everyone. Firstly, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we stand and pay our respects to our elders, past, present, and emerging. A big welcome to everyone and thanks for joining us for this FinTech webinar focusing on Trans-Tasman FinTech opportunities. I'm Stu from FinTech Australia, and I'm joined by a great bunch of panelists here who will be presenting an hour-long webinar with roughly 15 minutes of questions at the end. If any attendees would like to post some questions, please type them in the Q&A box and I'll run through those for the last 10 or 15 minutes. Very excited to present our panelists, but firstly, handing over to the Honourable Craig Knowles, our moderator for the session, to kick off and go from there. Thanks so much and enjoy.
Thanks, Stu, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our very numerous webinar participants, whichever part of the globe you're joining from. Like Stu, and as is customary, I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional owners and First Nations of all lands, but particularly across Australia and New Zealand, and on behalf of us all pay our respects to elders both past, present and emerging. Tēnā koutou katoa. As Stu said, my name's Craig Knowles. I'm the Senior Trade Commissioner for Austrade for the New Zealand and Pacific region. I'm based here in Auckland, and together with my colleagues Philippa Hawken and Stuart Keane, Austrade and FinTech Australia are delighted to welcome you to a discussion on Trans-Tasman FinTech opportunities. I'm sure that we are, all of us, in various stages of COVID-related lockdown. Right at the outset, we hope you're all safe and well, and sincerely thank you for taking the time to join us. Today, we've brought together a very strong lineup of senior players in the Trans-Tasman FinTech sector to talk about what's happening here in New Zealand, some of the recent trends and developments, and how to break in to and deal with some of the regulatory and commercial challenges and opportunities that New Zealand FinTech represents. As moderator, I'll be spending about half an hour or so in conversation with our guests. And as Stuart has already dealt with the housekeeping issues, please keep your questions coming in, post them up on the chat section of the webinar framework, and we'll try and get to as many as we possibly can. So to introduce our panelists before we get into discussion, can I introduce Binu Paul? Binu Paul is from the New Zealand FinTech regulator, the Financial Markets Authority. Most importantly, Binu is the FMA's specialist lead in FinTech and is chair of the FinTech Working Group of the Council of Financial Regulators in New Zealand. That's the overarching body that deals with financial regulation as it relates to FinTech. In addition to his current regulatory role, Binu has been the founder of a number of FinTech startups, been instrumental in organising and mobilising the FinTech community in New Zealand over a lot of years as a founding member of FinTech New Zealand. He was formerly the CEO of an investment research business and head of business strategy for one of New Zealand's largest fund managers. And like me, just talking to him before, he can't think of a better place to be locked down than here down under. Nicole Busson, welcome Nicole, is the Chief Customer Officer at Open, FinTech operating across Australia and New Zealand. Prior to this, Nicole was Small Business and Platform Director at Xero. Nicole's background spans high growth tech leadership, investment management across both venture capital and private equity markets, corporate innovation, both locally and around the world. Nicole is currently also an independent director of that magnificent Auckland and New Zealand institution, the Ice House, which, as many of you already know, invests in many early stage New Zealand businesses and is responsible for so many New Zealand success stories in this space. Jeremy Muir also joins us today. Jeremy is a partner in the Auckland office of Minter Ellison Rudd Watts and heads the firm's National Banking and Financial Services division. Welcome, Jeremy. Jeremy, of course, is a specialist in financial regulation and investment law, including FinTech and digital assets, and we're delighted to have him with us. And last but by no means least, our final guest is Scott Gunther. Scott is a general partner at IAG Firemark Ventures. Interestingly, I think Scott describes himself as a corporate venture capitalist and startup enthusiast. Scott and his team at IAG Firemark specialise in partnering with business leaders to help them identify and understand strategic opportunities, then help them deliver the transformation to achieve the growth that they're aspiring to. And I'm sure, just again talking to Scott earlier, he won't mind me sharing with you that his passion for science and technology and innovation is deeply personal. That's because Scott's an organ donor recipient, and he says without innovation and technology and science, he probably wouldn't be here today. So Scott, we're really glad you're here. We're delighted that you're here. And together with Jeremy, Nicole and Binu, it's great that you can all be here. Thanks to each of you for joining in and sharing your experience. So let's open up the conversation. Let's treat it as a conversation. Panelists have been well primed to join in, but I want to first of all start on the New Zealand ecosystem and ask Binu, if you wouldn't mind, just spending a few minutes painting a picture of the landscape. What are we dealing with here, Binu, when we talk about this developing fintech centre of New Zealand? Could you give us some insights on the leading capabilities and the environment for fintech in New Zealand?
Thanks, Greg. Happy to kick the conversation off. Before I start, kia ora, welcome to everybody online. I just hope that you're all fortunate enough to be locked down safely and well, and more importantly, that you're fortunate enough to be with family as well. So we in New Zealand, we kicked off our lockdown Tuesday last week, and it looks like it's going to be an extended one. So we'll see how things pan out. But thanks everyone being on the line. Just to kick things off, I just want to highlight something. I'll probably start off on the note which some of you may be aware that if I were to look at the Ease of Doing Business Index globally, out of probably around 190 countries, New Zealand is ranked #1 currently for both starting a business and to run a business. So against that context, though, I always look at innovation ecosystems through 3 different lenses. That just helps me shape my own thinking around it. So the first one is around access to funding and capital. Second one is around what are the enablers of policy and legislative frameworks. And then finally, what's the access to talent or the smarts? So talking about capital and funding, I would like to think that in New Zealand, we have a reasonably diverse pool of capital and funding sources. So primary among them, I would recommend you look up Callaghan Innovation. It's a government agency that is primarily responsible to foster innovation here in New Zealand. The website is callaghaninnovation.govt.nz. So besides the whole heap of things that they provide as support, they also provide funding, whether it's for research and development if you're early stage business, or it could be as part of your scale-up journey as well. So definitely worth having a look at the services they provide. Outside of that, we've got a handful of incubators, accelerators, catering to different phases and different parts of your journey. Specific incubators, accelerators, looking at businesses that can go global, early on rather than scale up in New Zealand first. We also have quite an active angel community here in New Zealand. So the Angel Association of New Zealand is the primary group that brings that community together. Outside of all of that, probably in the last, I'd say probably 18 months to 3 years, and maybe it's a sign of the sector maturing, we've had a number of very large or significant exits. And as a result, a number of those founders are looking to fund ideas here in New Zealand and bring that money back. So that's been pretty good from that perspective. And through the second lens of policy and regulatory frameworks, just as a bit of a context, in New Zealand, we have something called the Twin Peak model of regulation for financial markets. And what I mean by that is we've got 2 agencies. One is the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. The other one's the Financial Markets Authority. And between these 2 agencies, most financial regulation tends to kind of fall into it quite broadly. The RBNZ is the prudential regulator, and so its remit is primarily financial stability. The Financial Markets Authority, on the other hand, is the primary regulator for securities and investments and conduct obligations. So that's pretty much what the Twin Peaks mean. And in New Zealand, we have what we call a principles-based approach to regulation. So globally, if you look around different jurisdictions, it can either be prescriptive or it could be principles-based. And what that essentially means is the focus is more on customer outcomes more than whether you tick certain boxes. And I do think personally, on personal reflection, my view is the principles-based approach. Yes, both of them have pros and cons. There's no right or wrong, but I think the principles-based approach it is a bit more amenable to innovation, as in we can look at each new idea that comes up and see which part of the regulatory framework it falls into. And which brings me to the third lens, which is around talent. And I have to admit, especially in the last 12 to 18 months, we've had a bit of a crunch in terms of access to talent, given the circumstances that we're all going through. Having said that, and maybe again another sign of maturity within the sector, I'm aware of at least 3 universities now looking to launch fintech-specific courses. They should be online potentially in the next 12 to 24 months, if I'm not wrong. And some of them are hardcore fintech, and some others are a mix of software and finance. But nonetheless, there's more attention to those areas. And finally, I'd like to say that FinTech New Zealand is our industry association that pulls all of these pieces together. It's an advocacy group as well. And if any of you are considering looking, coming into the New Zealand market, I think that's a good first stop, just to understand the lay of the land. I'm happy to get into more detail as we go through the presentation, but Craig, that's pretty much broadly where we are at. In terms of rate of growth in the sector, if I look at the technology sector broadly within New Zealand, fintech by far has been the fastest growing in the last 5 years. So we've seen compounded growth rate of roughly around 35% year on year over the last 5 years. So by far the fastest growing part of the wider technology sector. So I'll stop there for now. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Bernard. But you've covered some good blocks of area that we'll explore during the next little while: access to funding, policy frameworks, access to talent. But I'd like to keep you, just for the moment, if you wouldn't mind, for another couple of minutes on the policy framework. Navigating policy, particularly if you're coming into a new market from another country, can often be daunting, to say the least, and navigating your way through is frequently difficult. But I noticed when I looked through some of the documentation that sits behind the FMA and some of the other work you're involved in as the chair of the Council of Financial Regulators FinTech Working Group, that there seems to be a real attempt here to bring all the various regulatory components together. I'm looking at some of the things you're doing to try and wrangle the multiple government departments, the various regulatory aspects. So not only am I hearing a principles-based regulatory mindset, I'm anticipating you're going to tell me that's because you want fintech to grow, but also a real attempt to try and make it as easy as possible for businesses if they do decide to look at New Zealand as an opportunity. Could you perhaps talk a little bit more about that for us, please?
Sure, thanks, Greg. That's spot on. So I'll probably again provide a bit more of a context here for the people listening in. So the FMA itself was established just over a decade ago as part, and it is set up under Act of Parliament, which is the FMA Act. And one of the remits for the FMA under that is to foster innovation within financial services in New Zealand. And in some ways, the role I'm in is dedicated to achieving some of the outcomes of that remit. Early on, we've always had an open door policy in terms of new ideas, and how that really works is we encourage product development teams and innovation teams to come in early on, get in touch with us, largely because we want to ensure that we provided the right pathway for people to kind of continue to develop the product. And so rather than having to go back to the drawing board later on down your journey, much easier to get in touch with the regulators and see whose remit it falls under. Part of the challenge with that, and as an innovator, because in my previous life, I was on the other side of the equation, often you would end up wondering which regulatory remit would you fall under, which agency's remit would you fall under. And even if you figured that out, you're still left with the challenge of who within those agencies you would have to go and meet. So in New Zealand, we've got an association or a grouping of 5 regulatory agencies. So the members are the FMA, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, the Commerce Commission, the Ministry of Business, and the Treasury. And collectively, we are called the Council of Financial Regulators. We've got a website, cofr.govt.nz. The council's been put together by the government to achieve a couple of macro level themes. One of the work streams is around digital and innovation, within which the FinTech falls under. So I chair the FinTech working group or the FinTech forum of the Council of Financial Regulators. So I call together a meeting of all these agencies once every 4 to 6 weeks. I also invite the Department of Internal Affairs to sit in on these meetings. The context being, and again, for people who are not familiar with the setup in New Zealand, we've got 3 supervisors when it comes to AML CFT obligations. So the FMA is one, the RBNZ is one, and the DIA is the third one. So depending on what type of product you're offering in the market, you potentially fall under one of these 3 agencies. So just to complete that loop, we have the DIA sitting in on the on the FinTech working group of the council, even though they're not members of the council themselves. And earlier this year, late April, we launched a new service, especially to solve the challenge I was highlighting earlier on of figuring out which agency you need to go and talk to and who within those agencies. And literally, it's a one-stop shop for regulatory guidance. The way it works, there's a website, fintech.govt.nz. At this stage, it's just a glorified online form. But it allows you to respond to a handful of questions, very basic things like what's the pain point you're trying to solve, how are you solving it, who are you solving it for, and what help do you need from us. What that gets you is a 1 hour, 45 minutes to 1 hour session with pretty much all the regulators in the same room at the same time. And you're happy to kind of shoot off whatever questions you might have. But I ensure that from within those agencies, we have the relevant people as well. So it's proven to be quite popular. As of this morning, I've just had 29 founding teams come through since late April when we launched it. So that's been very popular, considering that a number of these teams would have taken a long time to actually get in touch with all these agencies to begin with. But this way, the path, or rather the product to market journey, has been kind of shortened quite a bit as a result of this level of guidance. It does not replace legal advice. You still need to get formal legal advice, but it definitely puts you in the right direction in terms of what parts of your proposition you're going to need some guidance for. So that's how the council is set up currently. With the website fintech.govt.nz, we launched that only 3 weeks ago. Prior to that, it was just simply emails coming through to me. I've got some bigger plans with that website. So over the next 12 to 18 months, hoping to build that out into a full-blown innovation hub. It's going to take time, but yeah, working on that. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Benoit. That's been a very useful few minutes spent there, because I'm sure the listeners are always anxious about navigating the regulatory framework. I'm sure Jeremy, for one, will be pleased to hear you say you still need legal advice. The lawyers in the room will be happy. But I think it's also valuable to have had somebody who's been on the other side, as you say, now in the role of, if you like, the principal regulator. Let's find out what a recent entrant into the New Zealand market found about all that. Nicole, can you perhaps talk to us about your experience bringing Open into the market over here, your general experiences coming to New Zealand? What have you found? How's it been working for Open as you've navigated this new market?
Absolutely, and kia ora tātou from Auckland. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. The fintech ecosystem in New Zealand is one of my favourite topics to talk about. So at Open, we've got 50 people in Australia and 5 in New Zealand, and are building up our teams in New Zealand today. And I think that, when we think about New Zealand, there were a number of things that were attractive to us in thinking about it. I think, firstly, New Zealand has a pretty buoyant fintech ecosystem, which is good for us at Open because we partner with fintech businesses to allow them to embed insurance and sell that. So when you think about New Zealand, New Zealand's bred a number of great unicorns. Xero was one of the important fintechs to come out of New Zealand, as well as New Zealand having lots of fintechs going to Australia these days. So Sharesies and First AML. We also see Australian fintech businesses operating here, lots of them, Afterpay, Zip, Prosper. So it's working. That said, I think there are some differences with Australia. So, for example, we don't have any digital bank here. Maybe that's an opportunity for someone from Australia to expand out here. But there are some differences. I think New Zealand, to touch on Binu's point around the funding landscape as well, I think it's a really interesting time for New Zealand in terms of this and businesses starting up. Just to touch on the venture capital landscape, so Scott's World, I think there's been some important changes there recently. I think when we think about venture capital, Australia historically has always been thought of as more mature with Blackbird and Square Peg and Airtree and some of the more prominent players there. But in New Zealand, we're catching up now. So the New Zealand government, through New Zealand Growth Capital Partners, launched a $300 million fund of funds that they're co-investing alongside VC funds. So that's probably $1 billion in capital that'll be coming into the market in the next 5 years. So that means, there's going to be a lot of changes. So there's been some big funds raised recently from Movac and Global from Day One and Blackbird as well in our market locally. So that's the second big element that is attractive. And then to touch on a third, I think talent is an important one. So I think, there's a bit of press at the moment around it being quite difficult to access tech resources. But I think, something about New Zealand, because we're a couple of rocks at the bottom of the world. So many people from New Zealand, in pre-COVID times would go on what we call an OE. So, finish university or later in your life and you go abroad and get overseas experience. And we see a bit of an inflow of Kiwis coming back in with really great fintech skills at the moment. So we just hired our GM of growth that comes out of Monzo and Wise, which we're very excited about, bringing those skills to Open. And I think, there's a lot of people in New Zealand with these international experiences. So actually it's a very, very good source of talent. And something about New Zealand, there's not as many opportunities as in Australia. So you can often get really, really good people here. So those would be sort of some of the main things about the fintech ecosystem that we really liked.
Thanks, Nicole. That's all sort of good stuff, really, and it's lovely to see you remarking that some of the talent's coming back. The world's a crazy place at the moment, and if this is one of the benefits, so be it. It's good. But you also mentioned opportunities for venture capital and investment, and that brings us to a guy who describes as his passion, investing in some of these ventures. And Scott, I just might get you to have a bit of a talk about what you're seeing, some of the trends that you're seeing in the market, and also because I guess you're where the rubber hits the road for a lot of fintech startups, particularly. What is it that you're looking at as an organisation when you seek to invest or consider investing? I know that you've got some metrics that you typically lay across your investment decisions. You've got investors to answer to, and so it's not all just sweetness and light. There are some hard decisions that have to be made from time to time, and you're at the pointy end of all of that. Thanks for joining us, and be interested in your views.
No, thanks, Craig. And it's funny you think about what our views are. I think the comments from Bino and Nicole are very much what we see too, right? Like this war on talent, and we see it in New Zealand. A lot of the startups that we've either invested in or partnered with, it's almost on every single conversation we're having with their sort of founders or executives or boards, right? And a lot of this because the world's very flat right now. And Nicole sort of mentioned before, people have gone abroad, but whether I'm in Auckland or I'm in Melbourne, I can actually now partner and with a global company now. I can actually also be employed by a big tech company out of the US, or I can actually be part of a startup out of Europe, right? So not only can I work and partner globally, I can actually be employed globally, right? And that's regardless of where I live. So we've sort of seen that, the last 18 months, that sort of war of talent really grow. And a lot of some of New Zealand's best talent are now starting to work with some of these global companies, yeah? But I think the actual opportunity is to reset the table, because actually if some of the New Zealand fintechs are striving to, overcome some of this war of talent, you've got to think a little bit beyond your own backyard, because if the shoe's on the other foot, you've actually got a whole world to go and pick from to try and actually sort of see, is there any talent that can actually come and work with, your fintechs or your startups. So it's a big way we're starting to engage with the local market, thinking that way there. And then I think the other key thing, Nicole, you sort of shared as well about investment focus. I mean, whether it was the Afterpay deal, the Square did about a month ago, you know, we have had so many dialogues with US-based VCs who, you know, fintech has just gone crazy since the back of that, right, to another level. But, you know, investment by, you know, overseas money into New Zealand, you think about what's happened with LawView and BizPay and even, you know, some of the recent acquisition of Discover. You know, it's sort of part of it, we sit there and go, Australia's probably had its time, and it's great because Australia's going to continue to see overseas money, but it's actually probably an opportunity. I think it's New Zealand's time now, and it's interesting to see a trend that the global VCs are actually asking a lot about, and Nicole sort of talked about a couple of opportunities. So, but specifically for us, you know, as IAG Firemark Ventures, you know, we invest in startups to bring the outside world in to, you know, materially change the way we deliver insurance. You know, we've actually only got one New Zealand-based startup in our portfolio, and we're definitely looking to grow and looking for more emerging startups to join along with our, you know, Australian or US-based startup portfolio companies. And that startup that we've got in New Zealand's a predictive analytics and demand forecasting startup known as Quantifiable, but we're definitely looking for more. So, you know, we invest in startups that are either going to look at Horizon 3 or emerging technologies, think like computer vision, machine learning, IoT, deep analytics, or cyber. We invest into data, so startups that can bring innovative sources of data or technologies that facilitate data. Or we're investing into disruptive business models, so, you know, thinking beyond traditional insurance. Now, we've traditionally not led funding rounds, and you know, as a strategic CVC, we're not always looking for financial return. It's important, but we're looking for strategic value, like we said, like emerging tech or data or a new business model. But one thing we've recently done is we've actually had our second fund approved at IAG Firemark Ventures, and as part of that, we've actually set up an early stage investment program. So one of the big things for us is not to, you know, be as rigid in what we've been before, where we're really starting to target pre-Series A or seed stage startups in Australia, New Zealand, and throughout Asia, right? So I guess the big thing for us now, Craig, is that we'd like to sort of say IAG Firemark Ventures is definitely open for business, and our pipeline's ready for a lot of New Zealand fintech startups in those early stages.
Thanks, Scott. And I notice on your website, Matt, that you talk about as you invest, you like to have the founders having a bit of skin in the game. Can you talk a bit more about that and the psychology behind that? I think everyone gets what skin in the game is, but why is that important to?
Yeah, it's funny you say it, Stuart. Remember too, like I was fortunate enough to present at the FinTech Australia conference on this same topic about a couple of months back, and we sort of see the biggest challenge in growth companies, regardless whether they're in fintech, property tech, ag tech, med tech, it doesn't matter. Get to this sort of inflection point, and they don't really know. And as we're starting to talk a little bit about crossing the chasm and sort of move from being a startup to a successful scale up. So if we're investing to partner, you know, it's in our best interest to actually help our portfolio companies to scale and grow. So let's be honest, right? It doesn't matter if we've got the most amazing tech or data. You know, we invest a lot in people, and all the panelists will get that as well, right? You know, a lot of this stuff is a people business as well. But one of the things that we want to make sure, if there's skin in the game, we actually want to provide skin in the game too, Craig. So one of the benefits we have is that because we see so many different startups facing similar opportunities and challenge, we think we're in a unique position. So we actually have this dedicated portfolio management and strategic advisory capability. And as part of our corporate VC, we actively work with the CEOs, the boards, the leadership teams from the startups we invest with to actually help them develop their product roadmap, you know, help them with their sales strategy and sales pipeline. What's their capital and financial management plan look like? You know, how do we help them with their strategy refresh and KPIs and key metrics or people and culture? And part of what that skin in the game is really critical, Craig, is because if we can actually help the startups grow and go from startup to scale up, you know, it grows their ARR, right? Which is wonderful. It also helps them grow new, you know, developing technology or new capabilities. And if they grow, then as an investor and a minority shareholder, we grow too, right? But one of the big things that we're starting to see is that if there's something that New Zealand fintechs and New Zealand startups should actually really do, is find some great strategic advisors who have actually been a startup and have grown into a scale up. I think sometimes you learn not only the tricks of the trade, but some of the things you learn is not what to do as well. And sometimes having a mentor who's been through that journey before you can actually help you get to that scale up phase quicker than you'd possibly imagine.
That's great advice, Scott, and also the perfect segue into great strategic advice. Jeremy, I'm pretty sure Minters would say that they're the providors of great strategic advice and manoeuvring the minefields of regulatory frameworks and getting yourself going before you fall down too many holes. Can you just give us a bit of a background on what you're seeing in the market? And I guess the 101 of, you know, the three things, or maybe the couple of things new entrants really have to look out for. Take yourself off mute, mate.
Sure, Craig, happy to. Look, I have to reiterate what everyone said so far. And first of all, sort of praise to Binu and to the FMA for what they've done in terms of opening up some of the doors for people entering the fintech market in New Zealand. I look back, I wrote a paper for the New Zealand Treasury 2 years ago in 2019 that I wanted to call at the time The Wonderful World of Fintech, but the Treasury renamed it the slightly more prosaic Regulation of Fintech Jurisdiction Analysis, which is equally catchy in its own way. And basically, I looked globally around at the way various countries regulated their fintech markets. And some of the things that worked well in other jurisdictions were fintech hubs, so sort of single sources of information, places to access sort of multiple regulators in one go. And that's really where the work that Binu's been doing has headed in terms of just creating an easy entry point. So I think that's really important. We're seeing lots of cross-border traffic, both from Australia into New Zealand and New Zealand into Australia. Minters, obviously, as a firm that's in both jurisdictions, we tend to see a lot of that. So for someone like Sharesies in New Zealand, who I've worked with since they started, when they were moving into Australia, it was easy to sort of go through Minters in Sydney and sort of understand the differences there. And equally, we've got businesses like Steak Shop coming into New Zealand from Australia in the same area, and really just needing to understand how the way the rules work. I guess the first lesson for anyone coming into New Zealand is to do your homework, and that is both legal and non-legal. So obviously, you need to talk to people like Nicole and Scott in the business to actually understand markets and whether there is a market for your product. But on the legal side, you really need to understand that New Zealand just works differently than Australia. I guess a key difference is Australia has a very comprehensive licensing system with the AFSL, the Financial Services License. I always, used to put it if you want to move in financial services in Australia, you need that license, and then you can sort of get whatever categories that apply to your business. We're just not like that here. In New Zealand, we have licenses, but they're much more bespoke for particular activities. So if you want to provide a fund management service to retail investors in New Zealand, if you want to provide discretionary management to retail investors, if you want to offer derivatives or a peer-to-peer lending or equity crowdfunding service, or as of this year, if you want to offer advice, those are all licenses that are required. They all only apply at the retail level, so you can do a lot with wholesale clients without needing a license. And those licenses are all different, so they're not just subcategories of the same thing. So that's the first thing, is to understand that you may be able to operate here without a license, or you may need a license depending on what you're doing. We also have this regime called the Financial Service Provider Registration Regime, or FSPR. And you'll hear a lot about people saying, oh, you need to be an FSP to be in New Zealand. You also need to understand that that's kind of not a form of regulation so much as simply a list of financial service providers. And a lot of people misunderstand that. And it's basically, if you understand the way the rules work, then you can make your regulatory story make sense. And that's when you want to go and talk to the regulators. So to go through Binu's hub, there's nothing more frustrating for regulators, I think, than if someone shows up and says, this is what we're doing, what are the rules that apply? The first thing they'll tell you is to go and take advice. So it's almost always better to understand the way you want the rules to work and to be able to put that to the regulators and have them say, yes, we agree, or no, you're not understanding it right. And it just makes things go a lot more smoothly. So I'd always recommend that you do liaise with the regulators, if only to sort of put a name to a face, so that when you hit the market, particularly if your competitors start to sort of start asking questions or putting in complaints or queries to the regulators, that the regulators know who you are, know that you're advised, and know that there's someone that they can talk to. So those are some key starting points to understand when you come into New Zealand.
They're pretty fundamental, aren't they, Jeremy? And in the end, very wise advice, and thank you for it. I know from an Austrade perspective, Philippa and I in our office in Auckland are frequently talking to Australian businesses across the range of business sectors who presume that New Zealand is just the sixth state of Australia, just another add-on, and everything is pretty much the same because of common economic relations. There's much truth in that. Our relationship is the gold standard internationally, but it is that fine-grained detail, the subtleties in the regulatory frameworks that make the difference and can sometimes cost certainly a lot of time, if not quite a bit of money, and getting that early advice is important advice for our listeners today to hear. Just on that and entering the market, Nicole, I'm going to come back to you and just slightly shift the subject. Really interested in sort of some practical examples, if I may. And Open's only recently sort of had quite a bit of a win in the New Zealand market, and I know you're growing, and I know that you've got plans. I just thought, if you wouldn't mind, if you can share a few secrets with us. How did you go about setting up here in New Zealand? What was the market entry strategy? How did you find your first customer? All the basic things that go to putting some black ink on the balance sheet. And if you could just perhaps talk to us about that from very practical terms, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. So I think the first thing that we did was to, we thought quite deeply about our market attractiveness framework. So for us, we thought, hey, where do we go globally? We didn't say we're going to New Zealand. We thought about what was attractive, developed out some criteria, and we looked globally indeed at, where the most attractive markets were. I will say that we began doing this probably March last year, as you can imagine, when COVID was kicking off around the rest of the world. So there was a lot of uncertainty. So although we probably found that there were more attractive markets in terms of size and scale than New Zealand, with COVID and the uncertainty, we thought, let's go next door. We also have a founder in each market, which, made it very easy. I think there's a lot that you can do digitally, but still there is an importance for having people on the ground when you're entering a new market. So we had people on the ground, and we also had the digital marketing capability to enter New Zealand. We also thought a lot about regulation. So, Bino's one-stop shop has been very useful for us, along with discussions with Jeremy. So the regulatory piece is very important. We operate in a very regulated market. A third thing we knew was that it was really important to engage with the fintech ecosystem. In New Zealand, everyone knows everyone. So, really getting into the ecosystem was important. And the way that we did that is, together with Fintech New Zealand, we organised a Fintech Hui. A hui is the Māori word for gathering. And Bino and Jeremy kindly came along to speak at this hui. So we got the ecosystem together in Queenstown, great location. It was at the time when we could meet in person in New Zealand, but not many others could in the rest of the world. So that was quite exciting too. We got investors together, both local and international. We brought our fintech ecosystem, and we brought everyone together to just discuss what was topical. And I think, through that, we got to meet everyone in the ecosystem and build our brand a little bit. And in terms of first customer, so the way we enter a market is with a strong focus on partnerships. So we always partner with an underwriter in a market. So we have forged a relationship with Tower in New Zealand, which we're very excited about. And off the back of that, then we will be getting going with some partners in New Zealand. So we offer embedded insurance with all kinds of partners. But certainly partnerships are a great way to do things. We've also been working really closely with Austrade. We were very lucky to be able to go to the Morrison Ardern visit again back when we could all meet in person. So, that really helped us with our profile and things like that. And, because we're operating across both markets, just was really, really valuable. And we continue to work with Austrade on partnerships and how we might access new partners. And I think building the team is probably the last thing. So we're really keen on hiring people locally in New Zealand. So that's been very important for us. We've got many new roles that are out there today for anyone that's looking, and those can be based in Australia, New Zealand, or remotely. To Scott's point, we're not fixated on having people in a particular location. So all of those are posted on Workable.
That's great. Thanks for that, Nicole. I'm just going to foreshadow a question to all of you, because I noticed that Stuart will be shortly wanting to throw some questions in from our listening audience. But just to sort of wrap up our conversation, and Bino, I'm going to come to you first, but just work my way around the screen. The one bit of advice, that sage bit of advice from your part of the fintech market and sector that you would give an Aussie company, somebody on the line today, that if you're thinking of starting up over here, what would be the first thing or the most important thing you might do? Bino, if you'd like to lead off, please.
That's an easy one, Craig. I highly encourage them to get in touch with us through the fintech.govt.nz website. If nothing, I'll be able to share some useful resources, not just from a regulatory guidance perspective, but connect them to the wider ecosystem as well. So definitely use the fintech.govt.nz portal for that.
Yeah, I'd commend that website. It's easy to navigate, and everything you sort of need is at least in one place. And you've got an entry point into the labyrinth of what in Australian terms is I think a fairly straightforward regulatory system compared to a lot of the Australian frameworks, but nonetheless still needs navigation. So good on you, Bino, for that great bit of foundation work in the regulatory space. Jeremy, what would you be advising, that one important thing that you would charge billable hours for?
Thanks. Yeah, I think I would go back to just don't assume that things will be the same just because they might look the same. And a great example of that is the AML, anti-money laundering laws. For a start, you guys are AML, CTF, you counter terrorist financing, whereas we, CFT, counter the financing of terrorism, which may not seem like much, and it isn't. But actually, although our laws come down from the same Financial Action Task Force globally, they look similar, but they're different in the detail. And we've only got to look both in the media in New Zealand today for fintechs being pinged for anti-money laundering process sort of rules, and certainly in Australia as well. It's an area where the regulators are hot, and you can get tripped up if you don't understand that you can't just roll out what you might do in Australia into New Zealand. You may not need to do much, but you will need to do something.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Nicole, just working my way around the board, your one bit of advice as somebody who's just broken up into a new business here.
Absolutely. I think, while we may have some differences across Australia and New Zealand, and I argue over who owns Pavlova or Russell Crowe, and maybe we have some regulatory differences, I think on the whole, we have more similarities than differences culturally. And so New Zealand, therefore, is a great market for Australian businesses. Also, just being in the same time zone, it makes it really easy to work together. I think, broadly thinking as well, together we're a market of 30 million people. It's still relatively small as a market together on an international scale, half the size of the UK, a size of a big Chinese city. So, the more that we can do things together and approach the world together, the better as well.
Thanks, Nicole. And Scott?
Very similar sentiments, but I think we've also seen a few who have failed, who have tried to go over, and that's why we always think sometimes not what to do, it's also what not to do. And I think there's been some sentiments from the team about we are similar, but we are different. But I guess my bit of advice is that, Sales 101 is to know your customer. So if you're an Australian business trying to get into New Zealand, actually spend that time to understand the similarities and actually understand some of those differences. So yeah, I think you've got to just take a little bit out to actually understand that market and the dynamics and the regulatory environment, and also maybe who's actually treaded that path before and failed, and if they failed, why. So, but yeah, definitely sort of sales 101 in our world: know the customer, know the market.
Good on you, Scott. Thank you. Very common sense advice. And ladies and gentlemen, on the webinar, we are going to make it your turn now. And Stuart's been assiduously collecting your chat questions, and I'm just going to get Stuart to open his microphone and pass some of that information back, and we'll get our panelists to respond as they can.
Great, thanks very much, Craig, and thanks to all the panelists for your amazing insights so far. Yeah, a quick note, if anyone would like to ask a question, please pop that in the chat box now, and we'll go through it in the next 10 minutes or so. But to the first question, and Bino, we might go to you for this for some insights on open banking, and can there be shared open banking functionality across Australia and New Zealand banks? Do you have any thoughts on that at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So I've spent a lot of time looking at that whole aspect globally as well, into different jurisdictions, and clearly UK has been there for a few years now. So in New Zealand, one of the precursors to open banking, as you know, is the customer data rights framework. So we're still working our way through our CDR framework. Just to put that in perspective, I find it quite useful to look at fintech ecosystems at 3 levels. So the top one is all the products that you see, like a robo-advisory or a crypto wallet or an exchange of some kind. And then underlying that, the second level is all the technologies that enable those products. But underlying all of that, the third layer down, the fundamentals, is around the policy frameworks. So in New Zealand, customer data rights is one of those policy frameworks, which I think super critical for us to get confirmed. And the other one is digital ID. So both are work in progress. The primary agency for digital ID is the DIA in New Zealand, and the customer data rights framework is being managed by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. So that's the MBIE. A first level of discussion, public discussion, submission documents, that's been finished. That first round is over. A lot of work has been done on that front. In terms of timeline, I'm not entirely sure how far away it is. I don't think it's going to be this year, but hopefully sometime in 2022, we should have a CDR in place. In parallel to that, we've got a group here called Payments New Zealand, and that's a membership organization of all the banks. Payments New Zealand has done a huge amount of work into creating open banking API protocols and frameworks and governance and rules and what have you. So multiple banks are involved in that project, and there's a group of, I think, around 30 or 35 startups who are working on the early stage framework as well. So my hope is at some point the two are going to, we're going to see the confluence, or the two are going to conflate. And at that point, I think we'll probably have quite a healthy open banking framework in New Zealand.
Great, thank you very much, Binu. The next question, we're going to go over to Scott, because of course you have invested in a number of businesses who have expanded or are expanding globally, and one business in New Zealand as well. So what's the best way to identify the right partners to expand into the market, being New Zealand, or potentially other markets as well?
Okay, if I was to get that question correctly, Stuart, about teaming on a fintech looking to, or a startup looking to identify partners in other markets, I think one of the things is the biggest challenge you've actually got to be able to get to is that there are so many people who are knocking on doors every day. So when you're actually looking at your LinkedIn inbox, or you got your email inbox, or your text on your mobile phone, like it blows up. It does, right? But one of the things is having a true actual understanding of your actual product market fit and actually how this is different is critical, because we see so many that are actually very, very, very similar. So I think actually what we really try and stress is do you actually know your product market fit and what actually makes you different? The second thing I'd probably sit there and Stuart is perseverance. You know, just because I haven't answered a LinkedIn message, or I haven't picked up the phone, and my phone's just rung twice since you've been asking me this question, right? those who are very persistent and persevere actually start to get the crack throughs. And if that's the sort of, you know, one of the biggest opportunities we'd actually come back through is understand that product market fit and what makes you different, and be persistent and persevere, because eventually someone will pick up the phone and someone will listen, especially if they got that first part right.
Great advice. Thanks so much, Scott. Nicole, I might touch on you for that same question as well, actually, because Open, of course, we're expanding to New Zealand and signed on the partner Tower Insurance. So why Tower? What made you really keen on signing that partner to help your expansion to the market?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, we thought about the market broadly and got to know the team at Tower very well, sort of and aligned on, I guess, you know, there were a lot of points of alignment, but I think, you know, getting to know them very well over a period of time has allowed us to do that.
Thank you. And a final note, if anyone would like to add any questions, just put them in the Q&A box, but I might jump in with a question I have for you, Jeremy. Just picking up on something that you noted there, that of course Australian companies can get an AFSL, Australian Financial Services License. However, in New Zealand there are 5 or 6 equivalent licenses or subsector licenses that a company would need to obtain. For an Australian company wanting to expand into New Zealand, is each of those licenses a full rigorous process? So 6 times the process of achieving an AFSL? Or just, I'd love to hear any comments you would have on that.
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. And I mean, the short answer to that is that you're most unlikely to need all of those licenses unless you were like a full service bank or something offering multiple activities. And even then you probably don't need a crowdfunding license or something. So it's pretty rare that you would need more than one license. And in some cases, you may not need any license at all. I'll give you an example, which was Stake. So when Stake, who operate a sort of a micro investment platform, opened in New Zealand, we gave them some advice. And the advice that we gave them was actually quite interesting, which was that because they didn't actually handle any of the money or they didn't custody any shares, because they work in partnership with Drive Wealth, which is another sort of a US-based company. We looked at the way they were proposing to operate, the fact that they weren't actually going to have a place of business in New Zealand, so they were operating on a purely digital basis into New Zealand. And the way our system worked, they did not at that point require any kind of license. They did not even require to be registered on the Financial Service Providers Register. And that actually, when they did launch here, you know, got a bit of attention, because once other competitors were looking at them, or even the media was sort of they'd normally go and look on the FSPR register to see where they were there. They actually, you know, they weren't even registered. But, you know, we'd pre-armed the FMA and talked through the analysis with them. And that's just the way the system worked. Now, ultimately, now they are, because they, you know, had to get a potential to give financial advice to retail customers. That is now a licensed activity. But that's an activity that, for example, you might layer on top of one of these other types of licenses. But that form of licensing is relatively lightweight. It's not like getting a fund manager license, which has, you know, net tangible assets requirements and capability and other requirements. So the licenses vary significantly in the level of sort of both difficulty to obtain and the level of sort of capability that are required. So it is very much something that you need to look at exactly what you're doing, where you're doing it from, which regimes you trigger, if any, and sort of piecing it together from there.
Thanks very much for the response, Jeremy. That's it's a really interesting example that you've used as well. And I have been a happy user of Stake over the last few years as well.
Very good.
Yes, thanks so much. So just moving to wrap up, Craig, I'll pass over to you in one moment. But of course, from the FinTech Australia side, a huge thanks to our panelists, Binu Paul, Jeremy Muir, Scott Gunther, Nicole Brisson, and our moderator, Craig Knowles, for your participation today. We hope the audience had a really great time. And this video will be, or has been recorded and will be accessible to be shared later on. Craig, thanks very much, and over to you.
Thanks, Stuart, and to everyone who's joined us today, thank you for your time again. I know these are extremely difficult times right around the world, and the fact that you've taken time to invest in your own knowledge and your businesses, trying to keep them moving forward during those difficult times is a great credit to everyone on the call. Thanks particularly, a huge shout out to Scott, Nicole, Jeremy, Bino. Thanks for giving up your time, but more importantly, thank you for giving your insights and your knowledge and your experience. It's been a very rapidly moving hour. It's gone pretty quickly, and that's often a sign that things were going okay. So I hope you've enjoyed yourselves as much as I did. Just to pick up on Stuart's point, like FinTech Australia, both FinTech Australia and Austrade work hard, particularly at the moment, to try and keep business connected, try and keep our support for business, and particularly in these FinTech spaces, strong. If you want to know more about what we might be able to do to help, please just reach out. That's our job, to be of use, to be of assistance to you. I really can only stress that your participation here today has been a real credit to you, but a real opportunity for us to get to know you a bit better through that ecosystem that Nicole spoke about. The more we can develop these relationships, the better for all of us. So I suspect that we'll be contacting you fairly soon through emails and backing up some of this. Stuart said it's recorded, but for now, we've come to the end of the webinar. Thank you so much, our presenters. Great job, very much appreciated. Please stay safe and well. We wish you every success in your business. Perseverance, to pick up on Scott's final point, is always important. Keep persevering, keep dealing with the environment we're in. We're all in it together, and we'll see you at the other end. All the very best. Kia ora.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks and
Thank
bye.
you.